I'd like to start by thanking esSENSE for inviting me, and also thank the audience for spending their weekend towards promoting scientific temper. Okay. Imagine you were told that you have a twin brother or sister. What's more, the two of you are identical twins who were separated at birth and adopted by different families. You're about to meet your twin for the first time at the age of 19. What would be going through your mind? This actually happened to Edward, David, and Robert. Identical triplets separated at birth and reunited in New York in 1980 at age 19. The triplets were found to have, apart from the obvious physical similarities, many behavioral similarities, much to the amusement of talk show audiences at the time. But there's also a darker side to the similarities that we discover later. All three suffered from debilitating mental illness, eventually leading one of them to take his own life. The Netflix documentary Three Identical Strangers is their story. What we have here is a caricature of some of the ideas I'll be presenting today. In case you can't read the caption at the bottom, it says, "Separated at birth, the Malifert twins meet accidentally." But if you think that was a caricature, then what do you make of the twins, Oscar and Jack? Separated as infants, they were reunited at age 21, and it was observed that both twins found it incredibly funny to sneak up on strangers and sneeze loudly. Both twins flushed the toilet before and after using it, read books starting from the last page, wrapped rubber bands around their fingers. The list of common quirks just goes on. There were some minor differences as well, like one twin was a Jew and the other was a Nazi supporter. But even that did not come between their brotherly love for each other. On the left, we have Oscar and Jack. On the right, we have the psychologist from Minnesota, Thomas Bouchot, who studied many identical twins, including Oscar and Jack. Okay, next, can anyone recognize the two individuals in this picture? Half-sisters Nora Jones and Anushka Shankar, both daughters of sitar maestro Pandit Ravi Shankar, were born and raised thousands of miles apart, but each ended up winning multiple Grammy Awards. Nature or nurture? Psychologists from Freud onwards have been attributing all individual differences in behavior and personality to the environment experienced by people, especially early childhood experiences and aspects of parenting. But there's a problem with this. It does not account for the fact that parents not only create the home environment, they also pass on genes to their children. For example, it has been observed that children whose parents read to them grow up to be book lovers as adults. Is this on account of genes or parenting? It seems reasonable to assume that the environment is the relevant factor here, but how sure are we about this? As you can see from these Google search results that I've compiled, a lot of people seem to think that you can raise a child to be a book lover, irrespective of their interest. In fact, a lot of people seem to think that children are like lumps of clay, liable to be molded into whatever shape we choose. Let's see how you feel by the end of this talk. So, coming back to the question, for any behavioral trait, given that parents determine the genetic makeup of children, and provide the environment in which children are raised, how is it possible to separate the effect of genes from the effect of the environment? By now, you've probably guessed that the answer has got something to do with twins and adoptees. Twin and adoption studies are research designs which allow us to tease out the effect of genes by controlling for environment and the effect of the environment by controlling for genes. They are a natural experiment, God's gift to behavioral science. The logic of twin and adoption studies is not hard to follow, so let's go over it briefly. Identical twins or monozygotic twins share 100% of their genes and experience very similar environments when raised in the same home. Fraternal twins or dizygotic twins share only 50% of their genes on average, same as any siblings, but experience very similar environments when raised in the same home. So if a given trait shows a significantly higher correlation among identical twins than among fraternal twins, it must have a heritable basis. Here's another scenario. Identical twins who were adopted and raised in different homes by different families share the same genes but experience different environments. So if a given trait shows a higher correlation between identical twins raised together compared to identical twins raised apart, it must be strongly influenced by the home environment. Conversely, if the trait shows similar patterns in identical twins raised together versus raised apart, it must have a strong genetic influence. Twin studies and adoption studies are actually two different ways to approach the same set of questions. And there's no reason for the answers to necessarily converge. But in fact, the results from twin studies and adoption studies do converge, and this should make us more confident that the results are robust. So, we have the concept of heritability, denoted by H squared and defined as the proportion of variation in a trait that can be explained by variation in genes. Heritability, by construction, is a number between 0 and 1. An estimate close to 0 means very little genetic influence. An estimate close to 1 means very significant genetic influence. So with this concept, we have now moved on from the cliche of behavior is a product of both genes and environment. Yes, everyone knows that, but now we're asking how much can we quantitatively attribute to each? What kind of behavioral traits have been tested for heritability? Apart from visible physical attributes like height, weight, eye color, whether your hair is straight or curly, we have a lot of behavioral traits that have been tested for heritability. Everything from cognitive abilities to personality, from school achievement to mental health. There are literally thousands of physiological and psychological traits, diseases, and pathologies that have been studied. What you see on the slide is a small random sample. So against this background, we would now like to know what has the new science of behavioral genetics found. Number 1, all behavioral traits have a heritability greater than 0 and less than 1. This means that while every trait has some genetic influence, no aspect of our behavior is genetically determined. This first finding is extremely significant because from saying that environment is everything, psychologists are now having to admit that genetics plays a part in every aspect of human behavior. Number 2, psychological disorders like autism spectrum and schizophrenia have high heritability with estimates ranging from 50% to 80%. Addiction and substance abuse also show significant heritability. In the past, these pathologies have been wrongly attributed to various aspects of the home environment and parenting, making parents wonder, where did we go wrong? And let's not forget the crazy case of autism being linked to the measles vaccine. This next discovery is called the nature of nurture. It turns out that the effect of certain factors that were always considered environmental are in fact mediated via genes. For example, we saw earlier that children whose parents read to them develop better reading skills in school and may grow up to be book lovers. But parents are more likely to read to children who enjoy being read to. These same children seek out friends in school who share their fondness for books. This forces us to think again about how the environment operates, how the environment really influences our behavior and personality. We are used to thinking of the environment as something out there. But the same environment is experienced differently by people depending on their genetic predispositions. The last one, different traits have different heritability estimates, but the overall picture that emerges from twin and adoption studies is the following. Identical twins separated at birth and raised by different families are much more similar to each other than siblings raised in the same home. Adopted children resemble their biological parents and not their adoptive parents. Adoptive siblings are no more similar than random strangers. The environment shared by siblings, that is, same parents, same home, same school, same neighborhood, does nothing to make them more similar. Systematic similarities in the behavior and personalities of siblings is almost entirely due to shared genes. Now, because many of these results are extremely counterintuitive and the methods are somewhat complex, the entire subject matter of behavioral genetics has become a minefield of misconceptions and faulty reasoning of various kinds. So, I'd like to spend the next 10 minutes just going over the most common misconceptions. Misconception number 1. This is a fundamental confusion about what it is that we are trying to explain with the concept of heritability. We are trying to explain differences in personality and behavior in terms of differences in genes and environments. So, for example, you cannot say that 70% of my IQ is due to my genes and 30% is due to the environment that I experience. That is absurd. It makes no sense. What you can say is that 70% of the variation in IQ between individuals in a population is explained by variation in their genes. In other words, heritability describes a population and not an individual. Also, let's not forget that most of our attributes are species typical, that is, common to every human being, such as having 2 arms, 2 legs, and 2 eyes at birth. This is due to the fact that 99% of DNA is shared by all humans alike. Heritability is about the 1% of DNA that differs between people and makes people different from each other. Misconception number 2. Twin and adoption studies are not about comparing a single pair of twins or adoptees or even 5 or 10. Most of the studies have sample sizes in thousands or tens of thousands. The largest twin study done till date is a meta-study, meaning a study which pools data from many individual studies. And it was based on 14 million twin pairs worldwide. Yes, you heard that right, 14 million. The study was led by Professor Polderman from Netherlands and published in 2015. We also have longitudinal studies which investigate the same cohort over time, generating a wealth of data. like the Colorado Adoption Project, CAP, which was started in 1975 and has been studying the same subjects from age 1 to age 40. The study is still going on and will continue to go on till while the subjects are still alive. Misconception number 3. In some studies, the heritability of ASD, autism spectrum disorder, was estimated to be as high as 0.8 or 80%. Does that mean there is a gene for autism? No, there is no gene for autism. It's extremely unrealistic to expect that complex behavioral traits will be traceable to a single gene. You don't even have a single gene for a simple trait like eye color. So in this cartoon, the Japanese are supposed to have a gene which makes them wake up right when their station comes up on the subway. There is a method which allows us to search for DNA variations associated with complex traits, and it is called Genome-Wide Association Study, GWAS. And what these studies typically throw up are hundreds, sometimes thousands of associated DNA differences, each of which contributes a tiny bit towards explaining differences in the trait. And even then, all the identified DNA variations together fail to add up to the heritability estimated from twin and adoption studies. The rest is called simply missing heritability. It's like the dark matter of behavioral genetics. Misconception number 4. Heritability estimates are only valid within the range of environments that were studied. So we cannot use it to predict the effects of abuse, neglect, or other extreme environments that some children unfortunately experience. We also cannot easily extrapolate the results obtained in one country during one period of time to another country or to a different period of time. For example, suppose we were to estimate the heritability of height in country A, where every child has more than enough to eat, versus country B, where children often suffer from malnutrition. Now, we know that malnutrition in childhood can cause stunting in adults. So, which country would come back with a higher heritability for height, country A or country B? The answer is country A. If no child goes hungry, it means that variation in environments is low. If variation in environments is low, then a larger proportion of variation in height will be explainable by genetic variation. That means, by definition, a higher heritability of height for country A. And finally, the biggest misconception of all. Some people seem to think that any talk of genetic influence on human behavior is a claim of biological determinism, the idea that we are just puppets programmed by our DNA. There is also the fear that finding innate differences between people indirectly justifies inequality and discrimination. None of these fears have any rational basis, but to understand some of the reasons for people's discomfort, we'll need to go into a bit of history. During the early part of the 20th century, a half-baked science of genetics was being used to justify a deeply flawed ideology called eugenics. Here we have Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin. Galton was the first to propose the study of twins, and it was he who coined the phrase nature versus nurture. So, by all accounts, he was a pioneer, but he also held some strange notions. Galton was convinced that people of low socioeconomic status were genetically inferior and, if allowed to reproduce freely, would cause a decline in society. Galton and his eugenic society did not manage to influence any lawmakers in his own country, England, but unfortunately some influential people in America latched on to his harebrained ideas, leading to the forced sterilization of more than 50,000 Americans through the first half of the 20th century. As you can probably guess, most of the victims of these state-sponsored sterilization programs were Black, Hispanic, Native Americans, disabled people, or just poor people. By the 1950s, scientific opinion in the world of psychology had swung to the other extreme. Here we have John Watson, the originator of behaviorism. Behaviorists claim that humans are infinitely malleable with no innate behavioral patterns of a complex nature. Apart from a few basic instincts like hunger and libido, all behavior was supposed to be learned from the environment by a process of reinforcement or reward and punishment. In such a world, all individual differences in behavior and personality between individuals would be explainable in terms of differences in the environment, translating to a heritability of 0 for all such traits. But we know that is not the case. What we can learn from history is not to take an extreme position on the nature-nurture debate on ideological grounds, but instead go where the evidence leads us. This is, in fact, a core value of esSENSE. Let evidence lead the way. Behavioral genetics in and of itself is not racist or sexist. It neither endorses discrimination nor undermines the value of state welfare programs, affirmative action, or gender equality. Ironically, a society which manages to eliminate privilege and nepotism would have the maximum possible heritability of income and wealth. Because once you achieve equal opportunity of education and employment for all, it will be genetic propensities which determine which individuals succeed in any given field. Today, it is obvious to us that every individual is a product of both genes and environment. But to make any valid claims about environmental effects on behavior, we need research designs which control for genetic differences. That's what twin and adoption studies are good for. And that's all we have time for today. I hope this was interesting. Thank you for listening and see you next time.